So this week inside the Lords, there's been a couple of very big events that have occurred. First of all, it was the second reading of the EU Retained Law Bill, and this has become a real focus for those people who disagreed with us leaving the EU to kind of bash Brexiteers with. To be honest, it's a terrible piece of legislation, but all it's trying to do, to be fair, is to take the laws that were made in the EU when there was no scrutiny by Parliament or accountability to the British public. Those were automatically brought into British law as soon as we left the EU, and now we've got basically thousands of pieces of regulation and legislation that nobody has looked at. They were just automatically brought in, and this is an attempt at saying, do we need them or not? Should we keep them or not? The thing is, the government, for once in its life, has brought in a deadline and says it all has to be done by the end of the year. This has led to scaremongering about the fact that the Tories want to take every possible progressive, in inverted commas, piece of law or regulation from the EU and get rid of it. So the scaremongering centres on the fact that every worker's right, every employment protection, everything to do with maternity and women will be abolished by the evil Tory government. They go on and on and on. And I spoke in that bill, and although I do think that the piece of legislation gives too much power to ministers to decide, and that's a trend we've seen, Henry VIII powers and delegated powers to ministers. In this instance, I do think, I'm glad that they've set a deadline, otherwise it'd go on and on and on. I mean, if you actually treated each of those 4,000 rules and regulations as a piece of primary UK legislation, it would probably take decades to sort out. It's also the case that I think it's important, even just symbolically, to get rid of the EU retained laws, right? We've left the EU, and the main thing that really annoyed me was this idea that workers' rights were dependent on the EU legislative framework. And that kind of hypocrisy drives me mad, and also suggests that ordinary working people are need lawyers in the European Court of Justice in order to guarantee their rights. So I want to give a bit of a plug, which is bizarre, because I went to see a show at the Old Vic this week called Sylvia, and you'll notice it's about Sylvia Pankhurst, and you'll notice that actually we've got a black Sylvia Pankhurst, we've even got a black Winston Churchill, and I thought, oh, it's a musical, and maybe they're going to play identity politics, but you know what? They didn't. Brilliant production. And the reason I'm drawing your attention was because Sylvia Pankhurst, along with actually Keir Hardie and lots of ordinary working class people, fought for workers' rights long before the EU was the twinkle in anyone's eye. And it's a really inspiring, I was standing up and singing. Also, it's about women, and for once there was just no women, proper biological women fighting for women's rights. It was great fun. So to hear today's socialists arguing that we won't have any workers' rights unless we're in the or unless we retain this EU law was just sickening. The other thing is that all of those 4,000 pieces of legislation and regulation were brought into British law while we were in the EU, and no one looked at them. Nobody cared that there was no democratic accountability. So it's the hypocrisy. Anyway, that's that rant out of the way. Slightly different rant, but kind of related to ordinary working class people, I suppose, is just that there has been a massive argument going on, more based around the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but which people have been gossiping about in the House of Lords, and that is the making of Lee Anderson, the MP, as the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. So two things to say. I don't care who's the chair or the deputy chair of the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party are falling apart, and as a government have done a great disservice to sorting out the problems and challenges of today, and as I've previously said, have often betrayed the aspirations of Red Wall voters when they voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. That's true. Secondly, I'm not a great fan particularly of Lee Anderson as an MP. He's a bit crass and he says things, sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I don't, very often I don't. He did a podcast during the week in which he did an interview with The Spectator. A very minor part of that interview, which has become headline news, concentrates on his death penalty comments. The main thing I wanted to draw your attention to was the absolute bile that has been poured on Lee Anderson by commentators and progressive commentators who have called him, you know, gammon. What was it that James O'Brien said? Thick as mince. And he went on to reiterate, no, I really mean thick as mince. And then he said, actually, I want to apologise for using thick as mince because it's an insult to mince. Ho, ho, ho. And then you have David Yelland, who was the editor of The Sun, no less, calling him a red wall Neanderthal. And when you scratch the surface of that debate, it's got nothing to do with the death penalty. It's actually... It wasn't as though Lee Anderson's campaigning to get rid of the death penalty. And by the way, I really hate the notion of bringing back the death penalty, and nobody actually is advocating that. But it's a view, it's an argument that one might have. This idea that somebody who is a little uncouth, like Lee Anderson, says something that's not as polished as our commentariat, should be treated with utter snobbish, sneering contempt is really dispiriting, and inevitably gets linked to red wall Brexiteers, the gammon in our society, the deplorables, and that is what I find deplorable. So it's not so much a defence of Lee Anderson as a recognition that it doesn't take much for that real fury at actually Leavers for voting the wrong way, and the way that people saw them as unable to understand, you know, the deep constitutional difficulties of leaving the European Union. All of that prejudice has come to the fore in relation to the debate around Lee Anderson and where he stands. So, you know, something to be wary of moving forward. And then the final thing that has happened inside the Lords this week, I mean, we've had lots of debates on public order. I've been rather pleased to get rid of some of the Conservative Party's completely illiberal amendments on bringing in, would you believe it, suspicion-less stop and search, for example, or their ability to issue protest banning orders. But I'll be discussing that at another time, so we'll move over that. Anyway, the big news was just that I was just haplessly coming in, I had a meeting organised, and it was announced that President Zelensky was coming to address both House of Commons and House of Lords, and we all gathered in Westminster Hall for what was a historic occasion. Now, let's put it this way, I was very pleased to be there. Actually, I thought Zelensky spoke very well. I thought that the Speaker of the House of Commons in particular rather went on in that address, although the Speaker of the House of Lords was better, kept it shorter. I did feel slightly uncomfortable, I have to say, with the kind of over cheerleading. I mean, it's not that I object to Zelensky. I think he's actually perfectly within his rights to come and have to. Yes, we know he's asking for support and he's asking for arms, so he's going to say anything and do anything. But, you know, so when I was being attacked by the Russians, to be honest, I was at war for my freedom and sovereignty. But, you know, there is something slightly uncomfortable about the sycophancy in relation to him that I was kind of a witness of in Parliament. But anyway, I made the point that I was pleased to be there on social media, and my God, everybody's really had a go. And one of the things that was dispiriting was that people who just said, instead of saying we should be having a big debate about Ukraine and whether we support Ukraine and giving money to Ukraine, and this is a discussion that should be had out, which I agree with, because I think that when politicians just assume that they have popular support and don't try and win it and try and morally behave as though they're on the high ground, and that anyone who might be opposed to supporting Ukraine is somehow evil or a Putin apologist, that is a very unhelpful anti-democratic trend. I unconditionally support Ukrainian resistance to Putin's invasion, but that doesn't mean I don't think there's valid arguments that we should be able to discuss openly. And in fact, at the Academy of Ideas we're going to do that, and next week my colleague Jacob Reynolds is going to have a guest Substack post going into some of these difficulties and so on. But I really was depressed that the people who were attacking me for posting a photo saying I was at the Zelensky thing were equally intolerant of any debate, right? They were assuming, and so many people said to me, oh, you've fallen for their narrative, you've been duped. Well, I mean, they're the arguments that we use against Brexiteers, are they? If I disagree with you, you must be an idiot. Right? I've seen the light and you are the stupid person. And I think that that also is something we should be wary of. I think that we are entitled to have different opinions on every and any political issue, and Ukraine and the war with Russia, and whether the West supports it, how the West supports it, what the West's motives are for supporting sovereignty in Ukraine, or every part of that should be scrutinised, debated and discussed, and there's not enough of that. But to imply all the time that your people you disagree with have malign motives, sinister motives, or are stupid, thick as mints, actually doesn't help anyone. I'm glad that people are critical thinkers and want to take more than the newspaper headlines as their truth, but I'm less enamoured of people who just assume because something's in the newspaper or a politician agrees with it that you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction to it and think that that means it's either a lie or wrong or sinister or part of some WF conspiracy or whatever it is. So, as always, an appeal for enlightened discussion. I hope that you will follow this Substack and follow some of the arguments that we're putting forward and see that the debate is an important question. We're going to have a live discussion on this actually mid-March sometime, and I'll announce the details of that. And if you want the argument, let's have it out. Come along. It's just going to be an informal get-together where we can thrash out some of the pros and cons of the Ukraine war. I will just finish by saying I was actually glad to be at the Zelensky talk, just because witnessing history wherever you are is something that one can be humbled by, and I was pleased to be in that place. But I also was reminded very much when I went and saw the Sylvia Pankhurst. I'm not getting paid to do PR for this. I was reminded very vividly, though, that history makers aren't always military leaders like Zelensky, members of the House of Commons or the House of Lords. Sometimes it's the people outside, usually it's the people outside of Parliament and positions of power who are the history makers, as were all of those supporters of Sylvia Pankhurst, all of those working class rebels who fought hard for the vote and for moving workers' freedoms forward. So I'm more inspired by them than even hearing Zelensky in the House.